Well, welcome to Focus Today. I'm Steve Johnson, and if I were to ask you the question, what could you tell me right now about the War of 1812 and the impact on America, how much information would you have? I think probably just as much as a lot of us who say, I'm familiar with it, but I don't know as much as I really should about American history this way. Well, you're going to find out in just the next few minutes some information that you probably have never heard anywhere else. We've got with us the author of a book called Ships of Oak, Guns of Iron, the War of 1812 and the Forging of the American Navy. With us is Dr. Ronald Utt. He's a former senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, and it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I think of 1812 in this way. Probably a lot of people are going to say, isn't that where we got our national anthem from? Francis Scott Key out there and all the rest. But I've heard a lot about Civil War, and then there was World War I. Don't know much about the Spanish-American War or the War of 1812. I think there's a lot that we could learn about it. What made you want to write a book specifically dealing with some aspects of that war?
Well, I was always interested in what's called the Age of Fighting Sail, and that was the period from, let's say, the middle of the 1700s to the maybe the first 2 decades of the 19th century. The War of 1812 was really at the tail end of it, and it was a period of beautiful and majestic ships that went to sea, went to battle, defending their countries or conquering other countries, and it's led to a lot of sort of drama and romance of the sea, that in turn has led to quite a few works of fiction that have been bestsellers. Concentrated in this area. For example, Patrick O'Brien's series sold 8 million books over the last decade and a half, largely concerned with not only the War of 1812, but primarily the Napoleonic Wars that confronted Britain in its war against France.
Well, do you find, you say this is the end of the sailing wars at that point on a major scale, is that correct?
By the time the War of 1812 was fought, steamships, many designed and built by Robert Fulton in New York, were already working their way into commercial service, and commercial ferries run by steam were available. And over the next decade or so, you began replacing sailing ships with steamships, who were actually, because steam was still unreliable at that time. Many of the ships that were out there were powered both by steam and sail. So in case the steam didn't work, you still had the sails to fall back on. But the War of 1812 was really basically the end of that age.
And I think of all the paintings and all that have been done, and we just think of how amazing the whole issue is of sailboats and the cannons and all the rest. I mean, that does have a kind of a romantic view to it. Do you think that's an incorrect representation, though, of what war was like at that point?
There's always many dimensions to war. One is, particularly in the Navy, there is the swift and very attractive ships go right up through World War II with PT boats and battleships and cruisers and things like that. The reality, of course, is often in ship-to-ship battles quite a bit of carnage. Great loss of life. And back in the War of 1812, when medical care was very primitive, a serious wound meant inevitable death. So they were not pleasant circumstances to be in battle. Life aboard these ships was fairly harsh. There was no heat, for example. You worked at least 12 hours a day during normal times. And discipline was fairly harsh, and the food wasn't all that good. But at the same time, if you were at the bottom end of the income spectrum in any society back then, life was always harsh. Life was harsh for farmhands. Life was harsh for apprentices in villages and cities. So you have to be a little bit careful there, but. Nonetheless, America had never had trouble getting volunteers to man their ships during the war.
Now, let's talk about America at that point. We were not a superpower at all, were we, among the nations, especially when it came to sailing ships, were we?
Oh, absolutely not. For example, we declared war on Britain in June of 1812. They had about 500 warships. We had about 16, and all of them were at the smaller end of the spectrum. So we had declared war without the capacity of fighting it. So, but at the other point, and this is one of the reasons that why America did that is at that time, while we're not a military power, we were an economic power. Well, we were a very prosperous nation. We had a huge merchant fleet, and we were creating a lot of employment and creating a lot of income and a lot of money by selling raw materials that we were harvesting from our new nation to Europe and to their colonies in the Caribbean. And it was the interference with that trade which was one of the causes of the war.
And wasn't it through a series of rather unusual events we actually ended up winning? I mean, there are stories, as I recall, that couldn't have been scripted much better than they were, that actually caused the United States, even though we were, as you say, at a disadvantage, to actually come out on top.
Well, I think that there were three parties to the war. There were the Americans, there were the Canadians, even though there really wasn't a Canada back then, and there were the British. And each country now claims that it won the war, and it's hard to dispute them, because essentially, at the end of the war, nothing really changed. We had the same borders. We lost no land. We gained no land. The only thing that happened was both countries had quite a few casualties. But I think that the war had its ups and downs, and it's a good thing it ended when it did, because we were running out of money and the British were running out of patience. But I guess the high point of the war for Americans, and it's part of the romance of the war, or the knowledge of the war that continues today, is that having taken on the world's greatest naval power, we ended up in the first 6 months winning 5 of the first 6 naval battles, which shocked the British and quite frankly shocked the Americans as well, because they never thought they would do so well against the awesome naval might of Britain. But after that, things slowed down. The British learned from their mistakes and pretty much blockaded the Americans. And then the emphasis of the war shifted to the land, and in particular to the Great Lakes, where there were some major sea battles, or I should say lake battles, with fairly large squadrons of both British and American, both of which were won by the Americans, and both of which had a significant influence on bringing Britain to adopt more amenable peace terms. And so in 1814, on Christmas Eve, the negotiators for both countries signed an agreement that essentially did nothing more than end hostilities, and I think everybody was happy.
Well, as your subtitle kind of gives the idea that it was the beginning of the American Navy, did we really boost our naval capacity following the War of 1812, realizing we needed to?
Yes, but not by a great deal. I think people at that point began to understand the importance of having a Navy. The Navy was disbanded in about 1786 completely. The Navy and the Marine Corps were disbanded. We had no warships. The last warship was sold into commercial service, and it became a merchant ship. But by about in the early 1790s, we were confronted by serious challenges by the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, which began taking all of our merchant ships and ransoming them and selling the crew into slavery and putting them on oarsmen on galleys, and it was a pretty horrible situation. So that revived the Navy, and so the Navy really was revived and had several wars. There were the Barbary pirates, and there was the quasi-war with France. But the War of 1812 was the first war in which our Navy actually fought against the very competitive naval power that had fairly large and impressive ships. And having come out on top on so many battles, and later in the war, we also lost some, there was a new sense of respect and a new reason to believe that perhaps we should be investing more money in the Navy than we had been in the past.
You know, with all of these conflicts, no matter what happens, there are those names who kind of come to the forefront that live on in history. Like I'll mention a few: Stephen Decatur, Oliver Hazard Perry, Andrew Jackson. I mean, you know, we think of him in other capacities as well, and also Winfield Scott. The leadership that happened then, it's the whole idea that even though this was 200 years ago, there are things we can learn today. What would you say is the legacy that we can keep in mind that, that happened then 2 years ago that is still applicable today, especially with these individuals?
Well, I think one of the legacies, and it was the legacy that was first developed by Teddy Roosevelt in his Harvard thesis later in that century, was that it was essential for America, if it wanted to maintain peace and wanted to maintain open seas and free trade, it was going to have to start investing more money in a Navy. You can't wait until war is declared and then start building ships. Ships simply take too long to build. And so it was important to come up with a balance between trying to economize on defense spending while at the same time having some acceptable level of deterrence to discourage people from interfering with your trade, grabbing your ships.
It sounds like the same things that we're dealing with right now when it comes to budgets. Some things don't change, do they?
It's a never-ending battle.
Our guest, Dr. Ronald Utt, he's the author of the book Ships of Oak, Guns of Iron. I appreciate it. Thanks for giving us a little sneak preview into your book.
Good, and thanks for having me.